Hey everyone, I'm Jennifer Whitaker, trauma specialist, and today I'm going to talk about undue influence. According to Dr. Steve Hassan, cult expert and creator of the Freedom of Mind website, undue influence is any act of persuasion that overcomes the free will and judgment of another person. People can be unduly influenced by deception, flattery, trickery, coercion, and other techniques, including things like hypnosis, guided meditations, and love bombing tactics. And the problem is that people don't see undue influence as a threat to themselves or to the larger society because it's so subtle and it's so insidious. And this attitude is exactly why folks can find themselves in situations where they've been unduly influenced. And that includes some of the more horrifying situations people find themselves in, such as human trafficking, terrorist and violent extremist groups, cults that are led by really likable and charismatic leaders, controlling Bible-based groups that are pretending to be a legitimate religion, multi-level marketing companies, political cults, therapy and self-help cults, and even abusive partnership and family situations like narcissistically abusive relationships, for example. Now, because the concept of undue influence is denied, minimized, and tossed aside by the larger society, it's actually a problem that the global society is facing, and it's getting worse. And it's getting worse because we're refusing to look at it. All right, everyone, I'm Jennifer Whitaker. Like I said, I'm a trauma specialist, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. Please like, subscribe, share, and be sure to hit the bell so you don't miss any videos on YouTube, because there is an interrelationship between all of my videos. But let's get back to undue influence. Well, last week I talked about coercive control, and you might be wondering, is that any different than undue influence? And if so, what's the difference? Well, coercive control is a pretty obvious form of undue influence. And coercive control involves a threat of something bad to harm another or violate their rights, and it's a more obvious or blatant form of abuse. Coercion is an act of force that's used as a tool for making a person who is unwilling to come into compliance and do something they normally wouldn't. Coercive control is considered a more extreme or abusive form of manipulation. Undue influence, on the other hand, involves inappropriate enticement with something seen as good. Undue influence is a deceptive act used to influence the will of another person through the use of psychological or emotional manipulation, or some form of persuasion that's used to gain control over a victim. Now, there are certainly similarities between coercion and undue influence. Both coercion and undue influence are forms of manipulation that can be exercised on individuals or organizations to generate a desired outcome. Both coercion and undue influence involve the use of pressure or manipulation to induce someone to take a certain action or make a certain decision that they normally wouldn't. Both coercion and undue influence can be used to gain an unfair advantage in a situation, such as in contractual negotiations or in the administration of somebody's will. Both coercion and undue influence can involve the use of threats, either explicit or implicit. Both coercion and undue influence can result in a person making a decision or taking an action that is not truly reflective of their own free will. And both coercion and undue influence can be considered forms of abuse of power. And there are significant differences as well. Undue influence can be harder to spot than coercive control. And there's a reason for that. So let's take a minute and go over some of the differences. Some of the differences include, and you can look at the graphic here, In coercive control, there's a use of physical force, threats, or intimidation to make someone do something against their will. But undue influence uses emotional manipulation, persuasion, or psychological manipulation of trust and dependency. Coercive control is more overt, undue influence is covert. Coercive control is a criminal act when used for social or political manipulation. And undue influence is a civil and moral wrong that could end in legal action if there are visible damages. Coercive control uses fear tactics, and undue influences uses more subtle or convincing tactics. Coercive control could possibly be a single event, but it's often several events. Undue influence takes place subtly over a prolonged period of time. And coercive control generally is exerted by one person over another, whereas undue influence generally requires two or more parties to be involved. So this is where you get into groups. While anyone can become a victim of undue influence, there certainly are factors that make a person especially vulnerable to undue influence. And based on the work of Mary Jo Quinn, who works for the Superior Court in San Francisco in California, some of the more common risk factors include being in poor or declining health or having a physical disability, being dependent upon others for help or for care, having problems with hearing, vision, or speaking, having problems with memory, having problems communicating and understanding. If you have trouble understanding the consequences of your decisions, that makes you more vulnerable. If there's a developmental disability, if the person is dependent or engages more often in passive behaviors, if there's emotional distress, such as grief, anxiety, fear, or depression, for example, if there are language or literacy barriers, if the person is isolated from family and friends or other people in their life, if the person lives in chaos or a dysfunctional environment, and if the influencer knew or should have known of the person's vulnerabilities. So sometimes the influencer, well, I shouldn't say sometimes, more often than not, the influencer knows exactly what they're doing, and they're very conscientiously targeting. Sometimes they don't know, but I think more often than not, they do. Other factors that make a person vulnerable include life transitions. And some of those life transitions could be moving to a new city or starting college and, like moving out of your parents' house for the first time. Or let's say that you've just gone through a divorce or you've lost your job or you've had a massive loss to some sort of natural disaster or financial disaster or whatever it is. Big life transitions can make a person vulnerable. Being a seeker and constantly searching for one's tribe can make you more vulnerable. And just that desperate feeling to be included and not having that stable sense of belonging within your own family, within your own community, or within groups that you've been exposed to. That makes a person vulnerable. Now, undue influence can be harder to spot because it's so subtle and it happens bit by bit and over time. And undue influence often begins with a process that we call love bombing. And the love bombing often includes some promise of an idealistic fantasy. And so that idealistic fantasy might sound like something like, oh, it feels like we've known each other forever. Like we were best friends in a past life, or we were family in a past life, or, we're soulmates, we're meant to be, we're twin flames. Everything happens for a reason. This is so serendipitous. And not to minimize serendipity because it can happen, but I also don't want to overemphasize it either, because words like this that are kind of esoteric can be used quite insidiously to manipulate and take advantage of people. And the person who is the influencer is often incredibly charming and charismatic. And that's the thing. Those who exercise undue influence over another person have mastered the skill of using their charm, their likability, and their life of the party personality to reel people in so they can manipulate and control them later on. So they're the proverbial wolves in sheep's clothing. Now, the initial love bombing establishes a false sense of trust between the victim and the influencer that quickly changes to manipulative and controlling tactics. And according to Mary Joy Quinn, if you are seeing any of the following behaviors, you have a good reason to be concerned that undue influence might be at play. So some of those reasons to be concerned include the influencer manipulates or controls the victim's access to food, sleep, medication, or personal care. The influencer makes promises to make the victim rich. The influencer makes false promises or claims, such as pretending to be a financial expert or an expert in some other realm. The influencer is a professional or paid caretaker who involves the victim in their personal life or asks for gifts or loans from the victim. The influencer controls access to information. The influencer isolates the victim from visitors, from the computer, from access to a telephone, from their own mail, or keeping in contact with friends or family. The influencer instills distrust or fear in the victim. And it could be distrust or fear of anyone or anything in the victim's life. The influencer moves into the victim's residence or maybe even changes the victim's residence. The influencer changes the victim's usual providers, such as doctors, attorneys, or banks. The influencer makes frequent or repeated requests of the victim that benefit the influencer. The influencer pressures the victim during periods of distress, illness, or transition. The influencer uses affection, sex, intimidation, or coercion with the victim. The influencer rushes the victim to make decisions secretly and at inappropriate times and places. Or the influencer solicits or encourages gifts, loans, bequests, or cash from the victim. Now, this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the hallmarks that Mary Joy Quinn has been able, from her esteemed career, to point out from a legal standpoint what could qualify as undue influence. Now, if you suspect that you or someone you love is the victim of undue influence, the best course of action is to consult a lawyer in your area who specializes in cases of undue influence. Each case is unique, and there is no set scale of how many criteria must be met for it to be deemed a case of undue influence. Each state has its own statute on undue influence, and I highly recommend that you look it up and see what the criteria are in your state. I hope this information brings more awareness to what undue influence is, why it matters, and some of the things to look for. So if you have found this information helpful, give me a thumbs up or drop a comment below and let me know. Have you had experiences with undue influence? How is it similar or different than the information I've presented today? And how did you get out of it? Or maybe you're not out of it yet. I don't know. But feel free to drop a comment and let me know. Again, I'm Jennifer Whitaker, trauma specialist. It's been great to see you here again today. So again, feel free to like, share, subscribe, and be sure to hit that bell so you don't miss any videos. And I will see you all next time when I go over Dr. Steve Hassan's bite model to give you even more information on red flags and warning signs to look for whenever you are faced with somebody who could put you in a compromising position to be a victim of coercive control or undue influence. So I'll see you next time, everyone. Happy self-discovery.